Hello, class. Welcome to week 13 and topic 1. And if we were meeting in the classroom, just to kind of keep things in sync with the syllabus, we would be meeting on Thursday, April the 9th. So this is this Thursday's lecture that we're going to be talking about right now. Based on your reading in the negotiating book, we are on the topic of psychology and negotiating. That's mostly the discussion, the major part of what is discussed in Chapter 7 of the negotiating book. I realize that some of you are probably a week or so ahead of this particular topic. I think some of you have already turned in your reviews of this for last week. But in any case, that's what I'll be discussing right now. I think there are several aspects of that Chapter 7 that are that relate very closely to our discussion of selling, and in fact, many of them relate maybe even more closely than many other negotiating topics that we've talked about. The chapter is divided into mostly those 9 points, the 9 tools that are used in negotiations. They're kind of the do's and don'ts of negotiating strategy. So what I'd like you to think about there is that this is picture yourself in stage 4 of the selling process. The presentation is 4. Step 5 is handling the objections, and step 6 is the closing. But I think these negotiation tools are mostly as you move from the presentation into handling objections. So you could think objections moving into the closing the sale stage. That's where you'll find a lot of these will be applied. I'm going to go ahead and read the list, because I know some of you are using more of an audio version of these slides than the video and audio version. So anyway, where possible, I'll go ahead and repeat some of the material that's on the slides, so you have it in an audio form as well. Point number 1 is don't assume a fixed pie. Number 2 is consider anchoring when developing a first order strategy. The third point is avoiding overconfidence. Point number 4 is to frame your choices to your advantage. Number 5, look beyond easily available information. Number 6 is beware of dollar auction traps. Number 7 is encourage reciprocity. Number 8 is to use the contrast principle. And number 9 is to take a big picture approach. Don't assume a fixed pie. The gentleman pictured there on your screen is Milton Friedman, a economist, longtime economics professor at the University of Chicago, advisor to presidents, advisors to the Federal Reserve Bank, author of many books over his lifetime. He says that most economic fallacies derive from the tendency to assume that there is a fixed pie that one party can gain only at the expense of another. And how that relates to our discussion is, and I think we've touched on this at various times in our discussions of negotiation, is it isn't a fixed pie. When we're talking, or the transaction that we're talking about with the prospect, with our prospective customer, and again in this case, the way we're talking is we're the salespeople, and we're selling to prospects. We can look at this. We should view it as that it's not a fixed pie. That if we win and make the sale, that's the only way we can win. Another way that, as you remember early on in your textbook, the author uses the word not only win-win, but uses the definition of a good strategy as being win-win-win. It's a win for the seller, the salesperson. It's a win for the customer, and it's also a win for the salesperson's company. So when we say that don't just assume there's a fixed pie, if there is an objection, and if we determine this partway through the process, the selling process, and that would be more likely to come up in handling objections. Probably wouldn't come up as much in the presentation side because that's pretty much where we as a salespeople think that we have identified the problem that needs to be solved by the purchase of our product or service. When we get into the objection phase, we see, as we've talked about before, that is a kind of the communication process where for the first time now, we're getting feedback from the customer, and we might use that feedback to start thinking, well, it's not a fixed pie. We might be able to come up with a solution to the customer's problem where, in a sense, our recommendation can allow them, we may expand the pie. We may come up with by the nature of the feedback we receive from the customer, we may decide that the pie we had in mind is of the wrong size. It's the wrong pie. So what we'll do is sit down with the customer and basically say, well, if this doesn't work, what will? That's the flexible pie. That's the new transaction of which we can both, the seller and the buyer can benefit from that. Another Milton Friedman quote that I think is very very close to the one about the fixed pie is that the most important single central fact about a free market is that no exchange takes place unless both parties benefit. So you can gather from that Milton Friedman was a proponent of the free market economic system. His writings were all pretty much along that line and along those themes. But the point here is unless both parties benefit. So that's what we need to think about. I think we need to mention that again now, is that the transaction will not be a selling point, will not be a successful sales transaction unless both parties, or maybe all three parties, the company, the salesperson, and the customer, until everybody benefits. A second point discussed in Chapter 2 is to consider anchoring when developing a first offer strategy. And this is you're thinking about this when you're in the presentation stage of the selling process. Is the ball is in your court as a salesperson, and during the presentation. And if there is, the idea there is if there's some question about what perhaps what the customer might be looking for, they may be kind of uncertain. And this is where the advantage of being in a face-to-face conversation with the customer, of being present with them, about having a personal visit with them to make the sales presentation, is to start. It may be through their body language, it may be through something that they say, some kind of a reaction or question, is that they're kind of unclear about where this sales process is going, what kind of money is involved, what are you thinking about in terms of a reference point. So anchoring is a point of clarification. It's an attempt to establish a reference point around which the negotiation will revolve. What I'm suggesting here is that if there is unfamiliarity on the part of the customer, it might be wise to go ahead and mention unfamiliarity with what the price might be. Go ahead and put as accurate a price as you can. Mention that. Put as accurate a price as you can on the table, so that the customer can start thinking about the negotiation part of it. Okay, what are we talking about? You don't want to. The anchor serves as a good reference point, and it keeps it removes the surprise element from the transaction. What you don't want to do is to emphasize price almost at the end of your presentation, because that means you don't have much room left to make the sale, to answer some of the objections. The anchor is often used in negotiation adjustments. There's no question about that. Anchoring often occurs when the first offer is presented at the beginning of a negotiation. So it's kind of like, where are we starting from? And it may very well start when you sit down to make your presentation. The customer, thinking back to Dr. A in our dental office example of 2 weeks ago, doctor might say, well, before you get started, what are we talking about here? Give it, throw out a number so I can start thinking about that and sort of match up what it's going to cost me in relation to all the benefits that you're going to be talking about during your presentation. In the negotiation process, anytime the value is uncertain, and this is getting down to negotiation where we're really not sure what they're thinking about. If there's a lot of uncertainty, if you detect uncertainty early on while you're making a presentation, you may have uncovered some reasons for uncertainty in the pre-approach phase, even, and that sort of maybe some of that back and forth talk, the getting to know each other kind of talk. If there is some uncertainty, then ask the other side to propose the first number. So in other words, if we're talking about Dr. A in the dental office again, we might say, if we sense some degree of uncertainty on the dentist's part, we might say then, okay, well, why don't you give me a number? Why don't you tell me what you're thinking, so then I can make my presentation, in accordance with that, and I can start addressing your issues right from the get-go of the presentation process. One of the key points that's brought out in Chapter 7 is, and discussed in some interesting ways, as you might recall, is that it's about overconfidence. There is a quote here that I use as part of the artwork here. It says, doubt is often better than overconfidence, for it leads to inquiry, and inquiry leads to invention. I'm not necessarily, it might be a little bit strong to say that doubt is often better than overconfidence, but I think doubt, and it certainly should be, in a sense, that overconfidence should be certainly maintained and kept at a minimum. Too much doubt would also be would actually be a problem. But I think the quote kind of puts us on guard to the fact that, there is some balance between doubt and overconfidence. But what it leads to is inquiry, and inquiry leads to invention. And that means is there's some doubt, let's start asking questions early rather than later. Let's go back to what we said in point number 2. Let's decide, let's ask for what's the dollar amount we're thinking about here in this transaction. If I'm the seller and I see that the customer is in doubt, I might say, okay, well, to remove some of the doubt, this is about what this product is going to cost you, and as we get a better feel for what the needs of your office are, we can get a better price. We can put a more firm price on that, and then also assure the client, assure the buyer that before you've anything is put in writing, and as soon as possible after the presentation, you will have a firm number to quote. Inquiry leads to invention. That inquiry might be going back to step number 1. It might be that you've uncovered some opportunities to extend the size of the pie, to enlarge the size of the pie that is being negotiated in your sales transaction today. Overconfidence is a problem because it can be going in, and this is especially, it can be on either part of the seller or the buyer. What we're most concerned about now, and what we're concerned about in our class when we talk about selling, is we're talking about from the salesperson's point of view. But overconfidence can also be a problem on the buyer's side of the equation. It can lead to jumping to wrong conclusions. Thinking that you have all the answers and that you already had it figured out. It can mean that you don't pay attention to what the presentation is if you're the buyer. If you're the seller, jumping to the wrong conclusions, it might be that you think the customer is all but sold on the product, and all you have to do is give a little bit more discussion, and they're going to be ready to buy. That would be a wrong, certainly jumping to a wrong conclusion. Overconfidence can lead to neglecting the real or the practical solutions, and maybe the most important aspects of the deal. It might mean that too much overconfidence would mean that you're, as the salesperson, are not listening, and we know that's one of the key skills that needs to be developed in this selling process. The overconfidence might lead to little or no room on the part of the buyer's opinion. Excuse me, my computer came unplugged there. Okay, leaving little or no room for discussion and the other's opinion. It might be thinking that the deal it's all but a done deal, and going through the process of not leaving enough room for discussion, not being open to discussion, not finding out what's on the mind of the prospect. The fourth point there is, agreeing to unrealistic timelines, thinking that this would be overconfidence, maybe not only on your part, but on the part of your company to deliver. Timelines are influenced. There are many shortages of materials, problems in transportation. There can be any number of things that can cause timelines to be stretched out. And so don't be too overconfident, not only about how you're thinking about you're making the sale to the customer, but also don't be too overconfident about the ability of your company to deliver on time, to install the product on time. Frame choices to your advantage. This is, I think, an interesting topic, in that it allows you to frame choices to the other side in a manner that leads them to select the alternative that you prefer. If you remember back 2 weeks ago when we talked about, and last week as well, we talked about rather than giving one choice to the customer, sort of like, this is the product, take it or leave it. We might say, here's our product, and it comes in 3 sizes, or it comes in, there are 3 ways we can deliver this to you, or we can install, in the dental office case, we can install the dental office software now, and some point later, we can install the software that is that's integrated with the X-ray machine used in the dentist office. So give some choices, frame choices that leads the customer to select, and what it says on the screen here is select the alternative that you prefer. But what I think what we're really saying is, and if I was to word that again, I would say that leads them to select among the alternatives that you prefer, because I think the idea is it's not just an alternative that the seller prefers, but the alternatives that the seller is making available to the buyer. Give them some choices. Anytime you're offering choices, offer a selection of options. I think one here is this. We can talk about some of the some biases that come up in dealing with not only in the sales transaction, but throughout the management structure of an organization. And that is, one of them is that the people seem to implicitly assume that the information that is most easily available to them is also the most relevant information. Look beyond easily available information when you are making your presentation. Also be on the lookout for that maybe the buyer is using the easily available information, so that what you can do in your counter offer, counter discussion with the buyer is giving them more accurate or some more recent kind of information. The problem here is one of them that most frequently that we run into. It's called the recency bias. It's a human tendency, something we all have, a tendency to overemphasize more recent data. We tend to think more definitively about what we just heard or what has maybe impacted us most recently. In the sales situation, it can apply in any sales situation. One that I'll mention here as an example is that it's often a factor in discussions between customers who are investors and the seller who is a financial advisor. So, we've talked about that before as an example, is that your position someday may be, you may say you're a financial advisor, but you're not really a salesperson. Well, what financial advisors do is they use the 7-step process that you're all becoming very familiar with. It is a process of finding out what your customer needs, and then finding a product or service. In this case, it would be a service, maybe some financial instruments, mutual funds, stocks and bonds, those kinds of financial securities that would meet the needs of the investor who is a customer. Here's a piece of artwork that explains how the recency bias can come up when you're dealing with a customer, and certainly any type of financial advisor right now in the world and all of the confusion about what's going on in the stock market and in the investment community and what's going on in the economy in general right now. That would be someday that will be. Hopefully we'll be able to look back on this, and this will not be recent information for us. But right now we can see that people are looking at what happens to they might look at their average return for the past 3 years. They look at their average return for this year, which is January, February, March, and a little bit of April. And what they can think about is, I'm losing money. Should I stop now? Should I make a change? Right now, you can see that most people who have any kind of investment are looking at what happened most recently. It happens so quickly. What's going on in our economy and what's going on in the world right now, caused by the coronavirus pandemic, has had such an impact on everything about business, everything about investing. And so most people will be looking at, it'll be a recency bias. They'll only be able to look for what happened most recently, even though in the past, in this case, their average return on their investments was much higher. Now, having said that, it's very important to know and to keep in mind that even though the average return was higher in the past 3 years, what happens in the past is not a guarantee of what happens in the future. And so financial advisors will always mention that, or they always should mention that. But in any case, what we're looking about here is that don't overlook longer term information when you're talking about a sales transaction, whether you're the buyer or the seller. Take into account, use the full amount of relevant information that may extend over more than just what happened most recently. What happened most recently will be easiest that information will be easiest to get a hold of. It's what we're most affected by for right now. But if we're making long-term decisions, the most recent information may not be the best for making the long-term decisions that we have to make in the future. And that may be for example, if we're talking about the dentist buying software products for the office, it may not be the best way to make a decision about some software that might be a little bit costly and that there might be a little bit of concern about how much money the office is losing now, or that sales aren't quite enough, that I think we'll wait till we get more business, or I feel more, the dentist might say till I feel more confident about what's going on with my business. Those are all kind of natural reactions when we only look at the most recent information. But so let's try to keep away from the as consumers and as sellers dealing with our customers. Let's help them to look at some information that goes beyond